Okay, so I think we can start. First of all, welcome to one of the neighborhood lecture. Neighborhood is volume 2, is a lecture series that we organized here at the ENAC, in the School of Architecture, as a sort of domain or space of exchange between the professors that teach history and theory, or the labs that are involved in the history and theory programs. So it's a way to move beyond the lab feudal structure and to somehow foster some exchange. And so this is actually, I think, the fifth lecture, if I'm not wrong, of this series. We have one more actually, I think in next week, yes, which will be the last one. So, and of course, the labs that are involved in this lecture series are TEMA, which is Sarah Nichols' lab, HITAM, which is Alfredo's Tierman lab, and my lab, which is TPOD, and of course, the lab that is run by Christophe Angerouet, which I ACT, yes, ACT, sorry for these acronyms. So for this week, for this lecture, I'm very, very pleased to introduce Olivia Neves Marra, who is actually an architect originally from Rio de Janeiro, but she has studied in Europe first when she graduated in Rio as an architect. Then she moved to the Netherlands, where she got her master at the Verlaag Institute. And after that, she started her PhD, and she finished also her PhD at the Architectural Association. And now she's teaching primarily at the Bartlett School of Architecture and Central St. Martin, so two very important schools in London. Olivia's main focus, but of course, correct me if I'm wrong, is actually the history of and theory of gardens and garden as a space that is actually, in spite of its appearance, is a space that has been historically very contested, has been used really an instrument of power. So in a way, Olivia's approach to the history of garden is a bit moving away from the more kind of romanticized and pastoral, let's say, idea of gardening, moving to a more kind of political history of the garden. In fact, that was the title of her dissertation, was Garden as a Political Form, which was a very interesting history of gardening from the Persian garden to the English allotments. And I'm very pleased that she will present us research in that within that topic, because when I read the thesis, I thought that this was perhaps the most interesting and the most also innovative part of the thesis, because we don't know actually much about this very important chapter, not just within the history of the garden, but really within the history of urban design, because allotments have been a very powerful tool to build an idea of the city where actually the working class play a very important role. Of course, a role that was very ambivalent, as you will show us in your lecture. And so I'm very happy that she's presenting this material to us, which I think in the near future will become a major publication that we are all waiting. So without further ado, Olivia, I give you the floor, actually the table, and we are very much looking forward to your lecture. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Pier Vittorio, for the introduction, and Alfredo, Christophe, and Sarah for co-organizing this lecture series and having me. I couldn't be more excited. Sorry, need to. Should I like this? Oh.
Can you, is it microphone?
Should I try? Ah, okay. Thank you. Ah, okay. Maybe I should put it back where it was. Yeah, so I couldn't be more excited to be here. It's my first time in Lausanne. Um, and yes, and as Pierre Vittorio said, the lecture will read through notes and the possible working structure I'm currently working on for an essay titled Parallel Strips, London Allotments, Self-Help as Ideology and Solidarity as a project. So these research materials I'm going to present were mostly produced during my PhD research at the AA. And I'm now revisiting them with slightly different questions that have emerged also through my teaching practice and the work I've been doing with my students in reconsidering London allotments as spaces of mediation, where small groups of people may self-organize and start doing things in common. So it's worth mentioning that London allotments are, is it moving? Oh, sorry. Oh yeah. So it's worth mentioning that London allotments are fairly similar to many forms of shared gardens around the world, especially in the West, such as community gardens mostly found on the East Coast of the US, such as this one, occupying a rooftop in Brooklyn. Urban orchards, the so-called orti urbani in the north of Italy, such as this one just outside Milan. The shared gardens or giardini condivisi outside the center of Rome, and the so-called jardins ouvriers, or workers' gardens, like this one in Ivry, just outside Paris. And alongside these cases, of course, we have to acknowledge that, yes, there has been a more, let's say, full-fledged architectural thinking with allotments, especially in the work of Lebrecht-Mige, with proposals like this one, for instance, for the Hüstringen City Park, where a scheme of allotments, like this one right here, was proposed as an integral part of a complex scheme of public gardens and forestations. And this takes an opportunity because at the time German municipalities owned many idle lands, and Mige thought these idle lands should be reorganized and gardened by working families. And this idea somehow, of course, resonated with the original concept of garden city before it was somehow hijacked by real estate speculation. And the original concept proposed a belt of allotment gardens in between the belts of factories and the belts of, or let's say, the realm of large farms around the city ward. And even though, you know, this, let's say, overview of examples now, even though they have been shaped by very different contexts, they share forms, let's say, architectural forms and spatial characters that are mainly defined by horticultural gardening. And it's a very specific mode of horticultural cultivation, which is gardening done solely by hand. So no machines or deep plowing, for instance. And this generic trait of the horticultural gardening as a sole mode of cultivation poses interesting questions about gardening as a mode of building and transforming space, horticulture as an affordable alternative to agriculture, and what it means to how cities and urban territories are organized, and allotment sites and why they consistently sit in between urban centers and their countrysides. So in many ways, I guess we could say that this this essay and the questions I'm going to expound on participate in the broader discussion brought by this book and exhibition by Sébastien Marra, entitled Taking the Countrysides on the Problematic Relationship Between Architecture and Agriculture. And in the lecture today, I will take the opportunity to argue that a lot of the problems with this relationship between architecture and agriculture have a lot to do with the private enclosure of rural land. And as we know, private enclosure of the rural land is a process that has happened in similar ways nearly everywhere in the world in different times, but perhaps nowhere it has been more violent and systematic than in England between the 18th and 19th centuries. And in fact, just to reflect a little bit on the term allotment, it has emerged right at the moment when enclosure of the open field became quite extensive around Central Europe. So it's a term that dates back from the 15th century, meaning action of allotting, from French allotment or alloter, to parcel out, divide, or distribute by lots. So in England, the technical definition of the term is actually a piece of land allocated or allotted to a person as a result of an enclosure process. So it's a spatial paradigm very much linked to this historical process of parliamentary enclosure. So I'm focusing on the English garden, the English allotment garden like this one, because it is definitely a spatial paradigm through which we can understand this problematic history. And therefore, I think before we dig in, I think it's worth to clarify how I'm using some of the key terms that we will hear throughout the lecture. So as one of my main premises, I'm taking architecture as common knowledge. So knowledge produced by the labor force of a multitude, not just the architect. And in general, knowledge, as we know, is never really free, but deeply rooted in power structures. Therefore, no architectural history will ever be perfect, but only a limited provisional history. So what I'm presenting here is not like a total, let's say, atlas of English allotments, but it's a critical genealogy and a provisional history. It does take history as a form to produce a culture for architecture in regards to these spaces. As a definition of landscape, I'm taking the one from J.B. Jackson, in which he says that a landscape is not a natural feature of the environment, but a synthetic space, a man-made system of spaces superimposed on the face of the land, functioning and evolving not according to natural laws, but to serve a community, or I would add any other forms of social structure. And for allotment gardens, I'm proposing my definition based on my research findings. I'm here taking allotment gardens as spatial paradigms of ideological enclosures through which we may reflect on the working class struggle as we analyze the role of urban form in the production of labor subjectivity. I didn't manage to drop much of the jargon in this proposition, but I hope that throughout the lecture we will break it down and I'll be able to explain it with images and examples. But I just left it there also to experiment with how it comes across. So on the provisional structure for the essay I'm working on, it builds on this provisional history of English allotment gardens, focusing on London examples to trace historical shifts in the city's production of subjectivity. So the aim here is to use the allotment paradigm as a tool to understand how the privatization of the commons still happens beyond parliamentary enclosure of common land. So it's a process that started 200 years ago, but still happens as a capitalist enclosure of commons, not only of land. So in the end, I will show some of my student works proposing spatial strategies to unlock the potential of London allotments to become a network of social relationships based on solidarity rather than profit. So I'll start with the latest transformation in allotment form and practice that are now defined by the lack of free time and the everyday fight for the right to idleness. I think this is how I see the most defining trait of the present condition of London allotments nowadays. And this happens because the lack of free time is generic to any urban condition where wage labor and unpaid housework take time away from more personal actions like gardening, self-care, idleness, and so on. And we use this, let's say, this paradigm to basically, or this period, to basically explain exactly what are allotments, how they are formed and how they work. So the key questions right now is how allotment sites are spatially organized and collectively maintained. How large is each plot, and how labor intensive is to garden them when it comes to the lack of free time of plot users. So most London allotments are still regulated by policies defined by this parliamentary act called Allotment Act of 1922. And these haven't changed ever since that time. For instance, this allotment here in Mitcham, on the south of London, is a typical one that may represent most allotments around the city. It was formed in 1930s after the local municipality called the Borough Council of Merton, which in a way governs this area called Mitcham, purchased the land from this private housing development that you see around the strip of land that forms the allotment site. And as Mitcham transformed into a proletarian suburb from the 1930s onwards, the council leased the site upon demand to a local allotment association. And this association divided the site into a regular strip of 60 single plots measuring around 20 by 10 meters, and let every single plot at low rates with priority given to local residents who worked and who didn't have any other property. The Allotment Association managed the site and also assisted plot holders with gardening techniques and knowledge taken from pamphlets like this one, produced by the Royal Horticultural Society. This was actually produced during the Second World War to teach every citizen to garden vegetables everywhere in the city in the so-called Dig for Victory campaign, and these are still very much useful for allotment gardeners today. And the Allotment Association also agreed on rules to be shared by all plot holders, like restrictions on building tool sheds, or when and how to fence a plot, but never walling it. Rules on gardening by hand only, like I mentioned previously, and so on. And even though these rules prescribed space and use to a very high extent, the fact that gardening is to be done by hand makes each plot a personal project. So even though there was some prescription going on, every plot is different. Taking us back to this reflection on gardening as a quite let's say, not only a personal project, but a true mode of building and transforming space. That of course happens through seasons, so the time factor is very important. And this possibility of gardening a personal space resonates with Londoners of Asian or Caribbean cultural heritages who actually live around Mitcham, and for whom gardening can help with finding a sense of belonging, even though these groups may continue to be internally colonized, uprooted, and pushed further away to the new edges of the city. So precisely so, these groups of plot holders are the ones in the city who actually work full-time on precarious terms of employment. And so they struggle to make time to garden their plots, even though they really want to do it. And even the few workers who manage to retire are now pushed back into employment because of the sharp rise of living costs. And this has become a problem because attendance to allotment sites, so plot holders are not really cultivating their plots as they used to. And until COVID-19 hit, the demand for allotments in London was much higher than the availability, despite the significant numbers of sites around the city, as we can see here in this map. But now this relationship between demand and availability is starting to invert. So there are fewer people with time to garden in these plots, suggesting that the present form of an allotment gardening is more motivated by subjective concerns than pragmatic ones. So it's not that people really need to produce their food because of the living cost crisis. There are other concerns that are important, and those are actually subjective. Moreover, this decay in allotment engagement and demand will probably make it harder for associations to protect their lease agreements with councils, landowners, charities, or whoever lets the land. So the poorest boroughs that currently hold the highest concentration of sites might be the most affected, because basically their local authorities are more inclined to favor private or public housing over green spaces in general, as it is the case of most boroughs on the edges of London. And so these issues are very much connected to the process that we all know as gentrification, and with fallenness, which is a term that I'm borrowing from a scholar called Álvaro Sevilla Buitrago to explain the historical condition that defines allotment sites as as their managing associations struggle to fight the threat of eviction and state plan gentrification. So, just to briefly explain, quoting Buitrago, fallenness, according to his theory, is the condition of a resource or productive force set aside to accumulate potential value to be extracted or realized afterwards. And in the sense, fallenness, the fallenness condition of urban land, is essential to gentrification, as gentrification is the process of urban development in which a neighborhood or portion of a city develops very quickly in a short period of time, often because of urban renewal programs that uproot and displace workers away from these areas. A process that has been famously described by sociologist Ruth Glass back in the 60s, and of course still happening very much today around London. So the condition of fallenness becomes quite evident when we redraw these allotment sites within their larger urban contexts, as you can see them here in blue. And although gardening makes these spaces and their land actively cultivated, so not strictly fallow, from the perspective of real estate markets, gardening does keep these lands in the category of known public open green spaces, and therefore more easily open to future redevelopments, either public or private. So this was very much the case of the Manor Garden Society, evicted from their site in Hackney Wick in 2007 to give space for the London 2012 Olympic Park. It happened very quickly, despite the plot holders' efforts to mobilize public opinion. They did protests and petitions, but couldn't resist the pressures of both public and private interests, and public interests being pushed by the government, as a matter of fact. So, and it has also happened with the oldest and most active allotments in the city, Northfield's allotments. I will talk more about this later today. So the site actually lost more than half of this area, of its area for private and public housing developments due to a decision taken by the local council that managed it. And so this process of encroachments of allotments was actually massively accelerated with the Housing Act of 1957, because basically this act empowered councils to sell or lease open spaces for developers. And this actually, this document and the situation it produced was even worse 2 decades later with Thatcher's privatization of social housing. So this was a really critical moment for the existence of allotments in London. Because also, in a way, when it comes to the relationship between allotments and gentrification, it's a very problematic one, because the mere existence of these spaces, of these shared gardens that are visible in the city, basically it's analogous to the urban park in many ways. They add a gradient value to poor neighborhoods, because of their greenness, and now also because of their positive symbolism of community and neighborhoods that real estate developments desperately needs to sell a neighborhood as an inhabitable one. So, and we can, if we go back in history, we can see that this is happening for quite a while, continuously. I really love this watercolor because not only is very beautiful, but it shows, it's from 1837, and it shows a very large allotment site on the grounds that where the King's Cross station is today. And the allotment site sits next to a wasteland with a pile of dust and some middle to lower middle class housing around it. So here it is really clear how allotments in a way have anticipated, if not favored, these processes of gentrification around the city. And because of that, they are quite ambivalent spaces. And we can see this, can trace this ambivalent character since allotments were introduced in London around 1830. This was a slight late introduction in comparison with the rest of the country, because by the time the British Parliament had passed several acts of private enclosure of the open fields and their common lands to accelerate internal process of colonization through land grabbing, to privatize rural production, to enforce wage labor, and hence to reorganize the landscape into a modern spatial system of logistics, infrastructures to connect the rural villages and industrial towns of the north to the south of England. So although this map isn't the best, it's really interesting because it marks only the enclosures that were made by acts of parliament, and it clearly shows this kind of corridor of the systems of industries and infrastructure interconnected. And if we zoom in onto the urban territory of London, we have to take it with a pinch of salt, but there is an analogous process taking place because during the same period, most of the open land in the countryside around the city was also enclosed for the same purposes of reorganization of the countryside into an urban domain. So rural villages like this one here called Ealing on the west side of the city were rapidly transformed into towns. So a slightly different configuration and articulation with rural land, and ultimately into metropolitan boroughs, like the ones that we see around London today. And as these urban transformations were carried out mainly through parliamentary enclosure, they also dispossessed peasants of their custom rights to common land. Here in this scenario, we can see an example of common enclosure with the Ealing common remaining, let's say, spared by this planning. And so the peasants were dispossessed of their rights to common land and made both urban and rural land unaffordable for workers. So both working and living conditions became really harsh for these workers, generating a lot of unrest, social movements and riots against parliament, against powerful landowners and industrialists. And so, as a response to that, not simply a response, but partly as a response to that, we see the creation of large public parks like Victoria Park, famously, as the government's compensatory offer to mitigate the drawbacks and problems caused by enclosure and the industrialization of the countryside. And these spaces were meant to appease the workers with aspirational and healthy green spaces. In around the same time, the architect Henry Roberts proposed working class housing as a philanthropic response to increasing social unrest. I'm, of course, just mentioning it as part of this kind of context, and I think Pia Vitória will actually talk about it tomorrow. And in a way, you know, under the umbrella of philanthropism, we can also see how it happened with the emergence of allotments. So at the time, philanthropism was in general infused with this very paternalistic view of the workers and evangelical values for domesticating and educating the working class. And of course, this mentality resonated with members of parliament and the landed gentry. So this publication by the Labor Friend Society really represents somehow that mentality, as it was created to encourage private landowners to let allotment gardens at very low rates for rural workers. And at the time, the Bishop of London, who owned much of the rural land around the city, was very much influenced by this idea. And for example, he owned the parish of Ealing that we see here in the map, and was like any other great landowner. He was very much fearful and afraid of a spread of peasant riots, like the ones that happened in Kent, right at the time, at around 1830s, the so-called swing riots. And so, in fact, in his parish, many workers were complaining about paying taxes to him over the production they would do in the parish. So the bishop transformed the enclosure of this common here, called Illiding Common, this triangular piece of land at the center of this map, into an affordable shared garden scheme for workers living in his parish. And it's interesting to note that until then, there weren't any allotment sites in London. Actually, the only experiments with this type of shared garden were taking place on the north of England. And so the bishop really took inspiration from those precedents, but had to adapt it a little bit because at the time, Ealing was being transformed into an industrial village. So he subdivided the common into a regular grid of rectangular plots, each plot measuring an area of roughly 1 acre. So workers, which is a farming unit, so workers could have the bare minimal land space to cultivate their household intake. And as these gardens thrived, Ealing became a town and later a borough, the borough that we know today. The parish officers who managed the site kept a list of plots assigned to each parishioner. These are their names next to the plot number. And the same offices establish rules of tenancy and gardening to be shared by these plot holders. Many of these rules are basically the same we see in most allotments today around the city, but some of them deserve a little bit of attention. Because they really have let's say an ideological undertone, if not overtone. So especially this one here, requiring plot holders to skip work on Sundays, so to improve worship, for instance. So the ideological aspect or nature of these rules somehow makes it very evident that this allotment scheme was basically a pedagogical project for educating and domesticating workers whilst providing them with welfare. So as I've been saying, quite an ambivalent space. Here, just to quickly highlight the ideology behind some of the rules, like for instance, encourage domesticity with manual gardening, promoting industriousness with good cultivation and tidiness. So employment comes first, and so on and so forth. So all in all, the most crucial matter here with these rules and the ideology behind them was to use gardening to promote self-help, so workers would rely on themselves. And this, I mean, yeah, it's interesting, you know. Maybe one would take this as the possibility of these workers to, you know, live better lives, of course. But if we see this more, let's say, in a more pragmatic manner, we can understand that this aligned with the politics of the time, the politics of austerity, and it meant truly to promote individuality over collectivism, and, you know, self-help over mutual solidarity amongst the workers. And following this logic, even the tool shed, which could be somehow central to the allotment site, it could be shared by the plot holders. It was never like that. It was always individualized into this very self-contained, let's say, pavilion standing on each plot. So each plot, each worker had its own tool shed to themselves instead of sharing one. So as a result, allotments produce a pastoral landscape formally and practically different from the picturesque one. And even though it had originally emerged as a paternalistic project, the 19th century allotment was a space where workers would continuously transform and rebuild through gardening, and in the process form social relationships. And so that's why they are ambivalent spaces. This picture showed the site, the allotment site of Illington Common in 1894, when many of its plot holders became active members of worker unions. So no more the obedient parishioners, taking the side of the bishop and being grateful for that allotment site, but really producing a subjectivity in that place that made them aware that they could reclaim their rights to more land and better working conditions. In their ambivalent characters, these spaces were somehow emancipatory. And this possibility of emancipation, of the workers sharing the allotment, forming ties, and even organizing unions. All these possibilities resonated quite well with contemporary quests at the time for overcoming the power of the ruling classes. So hence there is an interesting relationship between allotments and anarchists, such as William Morris, somehow not very famous for his anarchistic views, because maybe the design work takes all the attention with the arts and crafts and so on. But he wrote this novel, News from Nowhere, about the possibility of common ownership and democratic control of the means of production. And this was much influenced by Kropotkin's work, such as the text Fields, Factories and Workshops, where he criticizes parliamentary enclosure and argues for shared horticultural gardens as a means to decentralize agricultural production. He doesn't talk too much about gardening, unfortunately, but when he talks about it, he mentions it as a critical paradigm of horticultural cultivation that could pose an alternative to agriculture and to decentralize the power of agricultural production. So by merely existing as affordable land holding schemes, allotments were a useful, let's say, paradigm for these countercultures in a time actually when both the making and the imagination of landscape was totally dominated by this pastoral idea of the landscape. And this was so powerful at the time that even today, it still seems that the English countryside, as we know it, has always been like the paintings of John Constable. It's this landscape we see here is only 20 years old, still like this, and in a weird way, both in history and architectural histories, we don't really know how it was like before. So maybe here comes a part when I'm taking a little bit of, let's say, risk or leap of faith. I'm not sure how it will sound, but I'm taking this opportunity to test. It's the end of the lecture. So I kind of traced an arc of 3 paradigms of allotment forms and practices. And now I'm trying to maybe propose an analogous reading of allotments and the shared gardens before the parliamentary enclosure of the common. Basically because historians don't really see or don't really talk about this possible relationship, because truly allotments were completely modern forms of garden. They were not nostalgic about the open fields. They were not nostalgic about that. On the contrary, they were compensatory actions to mitigate the problems caused by enclosures, but they were not looking to go back to the modes of shared gardening that existed before. Not at all. But maybe here comes the architect way of seeing history. I think there's something there because of the strips, hence the title of the lecture, and because of gardening by hand as a mode of really organize these spaces, not only formally, but also spatially, in the sense of rituals, of how people would basically even overcome or profanate the establishment of rules and so on. So I think this part maybe, or this thesis, is maybe lacking from most criticism, and I would try now to maybe throw some notes and see where it goes. So before parliamentary enclosure, London was surrounded by this heterogeneous landscape, not so neat as Constable's paintings, and it was made of manors that were privately enclosed a very long time, not by parliamentary acts, but by informal agreements. But these manors were also intermediated by open field systems. And these open field systems, they were these very complex systems of enclosures, spaces. Some were common lands where peasants had the right to cultivate orchards like this one, crofts, and so on, like many forms of small shared gardens. And they, on the commons, on other pastures around the commons, they could graze animals, and they could do other cultivations and share rituals. And basically, with this system of shared spaces, they could build this network of mutual support. It was basically driven by this, let's say, traditional customs and agreements based on exchange of solidarity. And within a typical open field system, most farming was about mixed horticultures and wheat farming, organizing to a complex weave of land strips called furlongs. And each furlong measured about 200 meters long, so they were somehow very similar to the first big size allotment plots that we saw in the beginning of the 19th century. And the furlongs were cultivated for the lord of the manor by a family of peasants. Each family would cultivate one furlong. And in turn, they could also cultivate a yard land or of individual strips for their own, for producing their own intake. So I think in many ways, this gardening practice, especially those which happen on the common land around the open field system, could be somehow reconsidered as analogous to modern allotment sites. And I think this understanding of enclosure and shared gardening before their privatization is very interesting. So before enclosure, practices of commoning shape space on a local use value oriented basis, generating a spatiality of difference. So in the long term, enclosure remains as a prominent territorial feature of the capitalist modes of production of space. So I think in a way where we are right now with the history of allotments, the open field systems could be reconsidered as an example, as an analogous, let's say, system of production based on solidarity. This is a LiDAR photograph showing the ridges and the furrows or the so-called furlongs that form the weave of strips that organize the open field systems, and on that side is the private enclosure of those lands. And it's interesting to see that many of these enclosures would take on the blueprint of those glebes, but they would basically make those systems of farms far more homogeneous and also more more prescribed within a capitalist logic of reorganizing the countryside. This is a diagram of a typical open field system with the furlongs units defining this very complex and rich fabric of mixed culture farming and horticultures. And this is how it was reparcellated and reorganized into this more like endlessly factory-like system of industries and farmlands. And so, and I think there's something here we could maybe try to reconsider in how allotments are formed and how they can be transformed further on. An interesting book to take into account is this one by David Crouch and Colin Ward. I think they offer fairly critical view on allotments, but still fall into this romanticized take on them. I think maybe I think architecture could perhaps offer more criticism when it comes to how space is organized through gardening and the introduction of new rules and so on. Colin Watts actually wrote a re-edition of Kropotkin Fuse factories and workshops. So I think this can also become an interesting example to think about that, you know, of history being used as a project, as a way to propose an alternative take on very on the past, let's say, on the process through which the city is produced. And so, in a way, going back to Sébastien Marot's recent exhibition, I think this reconsideration of allotments within the production of the urban territory also resonates with the scenarios that he put forward in his book, particularly this one, the secession, where allotment gardening is actually dispersed and infused within an urban grain that is not totally defined by urban planning. And so with this, I like to conclude with just quickly going through some spatial strategies for possible networks of London allotments I'm working with my students. In our design brief, we take some ideas that reconsider these shared spaces as the very locus for possible potential possible formations of relationships and production and commoning based on solidarity and exchange of gifts and so on. And also we take the worker in generic terms. So we are not so much thinking about whether the population of these allotments is old or we are taking the subject of these allotments more as a generic condition that could be found elsewhere in the world, not only in the West. But we are also taking on London precedents of self-organization and also collective purchasing of idle lands, such as this one with Rochester Square Garden, where this really powerful, not powerful, but wealthy individual purchased this abandoned square garden and made it into this kind of shared community garden occupied by this pottery studio, and they launched this common suppers for the neighbors around the site. So this could be a trend that could be given place and form by these spatial strategies. And so, as a practice, I think this the take on allotments would require architects to rethink what it means to work as an architect, and what it means to draw up spaces, what it means to work with allotments associations. So the architect would have to be maybe someone present, maybe a member, maybe someone deeply engaged with the everyday life of these places, and somebody who would be willing to use drawing as a tool to deeply trace rituals, how rituals happen in space, and not only gardening rituals, but other possible rituals that may vary from site to site, and define them as subjective spaces. And in tracing rituals, it would be also very important to trace the objects, how these spaces are spatially organized, and what it means to the formation of the entire site and its relationship with the city. And then this is an interesting strategy that takes the inventory of objects and rituals to propose this shared wall that somehow rethinks the allotment boundary. So on top of the screen, you see the existing allotment, and that boundary is placed to negotiate shared spaces between the allotment plot holders and the residents of this nuclear family housing built in the 30s, just next to the site. And I mean, it's a second year student drawing, so there are some things that need to be taken with a pinch of salt. But what I really find very interesting in this take is that we can see the backyard gardens of the private housing just next to the allotment sites, and we can see that there is a similarity in terms of size and shape, but nevertheless these gardens, these spaces are completely different in their characters, and hence the subjective need for allotments in a city like London that has maybe too many parks and green spaces. So I think this is another thing that's really important when it comes to producing this history, this critical history on allotments, is to say that it's not really about having access to green spaces and outdoors. There's something far more subjective, personal, and political about cultivating these spaces. And it's also about being in a shared space for gardening. Even if this gardening remains individual, you are gardening amongst other people in similar conditions than you. And this can be potentially quite emancipatory and gradually form a network of solidarity for small groups of people. It's not that this would happen to every plot holder, but some groups would somehow form. And with this last proposal, a little bit out there, but quite interesting, a student who used this method of the inventory of materials found on site to propose an architecture, rules for building on an allotment with an architecture directly constrained by the quantity and nature of materials found on site. And she proposed this scheme of temporary pavilions built through gardening and also foraging. So here's an interesting take on gardening in articulated with foraging as two modes of building and transforming these shared spaces. Yeah. Thank you so much for bearing with me. I think you were extremely kind, and I'm really, really happy, and I'm really looking forward to having a conversation with everybody in the room. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Olivia, for this fantastic presentation. I think it's very great to see the work that combines scholarship and also a design approach. In a way, I really believe that sometimes, not always, of course, historians or let's say historical research can also use architectural tools to intervene within the present, but also to propose reconstructions of the past. And I think your work, of course, is very much about that, and especially the use of drawing, I think is very important in your work, and I knew this also from before, and I think that it's really powerful, especially because redrawing allotments is redrawing something that we never consider as architecture in a way. I mean, I think that for me the interesting aspect of this exercise, also as a pedagogical exercise, is that it's very easy to draw buildings, no? To draw buildings because we have straight lines, we have very clear boundaries. But I always found, I mean, also in my own practice, but also teaching to students, the representation of gardens and vegetal plants, and it's much more challenging because this abstraction of drawing somehow is always problematic when we project it to this world where boundaries are not so clear. So I wonder whether in your approach, drawing is something that is parallel to the scholar work, or is something that comes after, or it comes before? I mean, what is the temporal relationship between the drawing and the more, let's say, research scholar investigation on your topic?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for that. It comes before, at least so far, it has always come before.
Mm-hmm.
Like, also, maybe that's a sign of me not being very knowledgeable, but I'm usually attracted to case studies also by the first thing I see, which is the picture or the drawings.
Yeah.
So it comes before, and also is definitely a research tool to understand what I'm looking at. We only understand the space when we draw it. We only understand a case study when we trace it, or we begin to understand it once we start tracing it and redrawing it. So it's definitely a process that start before reading and writing, but continues. And also as also in any project, there are stages to these drawings. So they start as working drawings, and after the text is done, comes another, and also the drawings I make for the presentations, they also, actually, some of the drawings I show here are somehow placeholders. I wish I had, let's say, we reworked on them for the purpose of the presentation,
Right.
to better articulate with the the content and yeah, and the way we speak and so on.
No, maybe before I give the microphone to the audience, I'm sure there are many questions perhaps, but another thing that I wanted to emphasize that I think is really interesting is to show that the open field system, which always romanticizes a kind of open as such, in fact, it was very much ruled by boundaries and by almost individual possessions of land. But what was actually, as you and your drawing shows that very well, that in a way in fact, paradoxically, the post-enclosure landscape is more open than the pre-enclosure landscape, no? Because in fact the pre-enclosure landscape was far more parcel, much more divided by parcels. But what was actually cooperative was the cultivation and the care of this landscape. Well, actually, in the post-enclosure landscape, the boundary, I mean, the landscape is more open, and in fact, that was very much used by the improvers to justify the enclosures. Like the salient system was considered too messy and too fragmented, and in a way, the idea of making these big pastures or big fields was a way to say, well, you know, it's more clean, it's more tidy, but then the boundaries becomes very, very strong. I wonder whether in your research, maybe it's very, I mean, or you can elaborate on the idea of boundary, because I think the boundary of the enclosure is very different from the boundary of the allotment, or let's say the boundary of the open field system.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, to go back before the question, to go back to your point, I think also that openness and re-parcellation performed by parliamentary enclosure had a lot to do with the establishment of wage labor farming. So, because in the open field system, of course, because there were more laborers, more labor force, there was plowing by horse, but I mean, there were more men working because of the method of cultivation. So here we move towards a more like factory assembly line sort of agriculture, increasingly mechanized. And of course, this gradually reshapes these spaces. And so I think that's why the fact that allotment gardening has always, I mean, this is something very consistent amongst London allotments, but also allotments everywhere in Europe at least. It's always done by hand. And I think it has a lot to do with scale and also with the nature of the boundaries in between plots. But do you mean the boundaries around the allotment, defining the site, or the boundaries between single plots?
The between the plots, because there were ditches, for example. No? I mean, people knew what was mine and what was yours. I mean, it was not. There was a right of trespassing, so people could roam across the fields, but there was a clear sense of ownership, let's say, of individual ownership. So there were boundaries, and people were very respectful of these boundaries. But of course, there were not the boundaries of the post-enclosure, where you have hedgerows, you have trees, you have very fences, you know, dry stone walls.
Yeah. The thing is, in the case of the allotments, this, let's say, soft boundary between the plots was actually to make the point that first, allotments weren't charity.
Yeah.
They were affirmative schemes of affordable small land holdings for horticulture, but they were no charity. They were rented. They were very much within this logic of private property,
Yeah.
the ideology behind some of the rules were actually for respecting private property, like the no trespassing or no theft and so on. And so but there was also a practical, let's say, reason also to enable coexistence. So each plot holder will have their space. This would somehow avoid conflict, and also because these cultivations would take a lot of time, within years. I think there was a practical need for having that boundary. But like we saw in the presentation, these plots could never be walled or fenced in, not fenced in sometimes, but not permanently. So yeah, and I think in the case of the ridges and furrows open systems, no, sorry, in the case of the enclosed farms, there was also, let's say, a need or a question for making the new boundaries generated by enclosures seem natural, seem like they have always been there. We see this in Cornish hedges around Cornwall, that they look much older than they were, and they allude to very old medieval and even Celtic techniques of making hedges. So, and they were very low, so it was not almost as if we can even think, if we don't know very well, we can even think that these hedges were part of the open fields. You would have some ditches and hedges, but they would never encircle the glebes. They would maybe be like strips. Yeah, just strips, like parallel with the furloughs, but never encircling a grid of furloughs. So it was not really about enclosing a piece of land.
I mean, following your title is like parallel strip versus the grid in a way.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know if there are questions. Maybe Alfredo and then Mats.
Thank you for the presentation. Very, very interesting, also very beautiful material. I think for the students that are here, I think it was a great lesson on just how the lecture was put together, that you start with the present and then you go backwards. I just want to comment that very briefly. But I just would like to hear more from you on the relationship between the history you're telling of allotment gardens and how it processed the history of anarchism. Because I think there's a parallel. I'm going to formulate slightly longer the question, but it's really me wanting to hear from you more about your take on anarchism and the few slides in which Kropotkin and William Morris show up in the story. Because there's, I mean, this tension between anarchism and socialism has been told from the side of, you know, the built environment for the most part. But I think there's an interesting potential in telling that story through the material that you're looking at. So the tension between state socialism and anarchism. And if one even look a very, I think, very little commented part on the famous essay of Robin Evans on figures, doors, and passages is basically a critique of Victorian era anarchism, William Morris, by being so busy with doing art and crafts things, but have totally left out the spatial conditions of the working class, basically. So there is an undertone of critique of anarchism there, but I was just connecting this with the story of Germany, you know, how the theories of Evans and Howard landed in Germany, arrived in a, I mean, of which media is an outgrowth of that movement, arrived in a circle that they were anarchists, very much on the right wing, very strange. So a very strange combination in which through this movement of doing what they defined as internal colonization through the allotment gardens, they could do what, as they define, could do politics without getting into state politics. So it was a political move to instaurate a political project without putting this into votes and elections. It's very much there. So it is a very interesting but complicated story, right? That the land would allow for this internal colonization through a political project linked to anarchism as a means to undermine the power of the state. So the tension there is played not on social housing and so on, but in really administrating land. So I just wanted to hear more from you if the story in Britain maps more or less the story in Germany, because really the people who were from the Ganzstadtbewegung were the very active later in National Socialist politics. This, of course, is not to say that if you are a gardener, you are a Nazi, but I'm just, I'm interested because I know that you know the story way better than me, Andy. So if there are parallels, what is the role that anarchism plays in your story?
Mm.
I leave it there.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, on this, let's say, parts, I'm still, I still need to research further. Also, from what I know, this relationship in England between allotment sites and anarchist thinking, let's say, was something that happened more, let's say, clearly, more intentionally, much later. I think I mentioned the case studies in parallel with contemporary publications like Morris' novel or Kropotkin writings, but there wasn't even in these texts, gardening, allotment gardening, they weren't so let's say so much talked about, not thoroughly. And I think let's say I'm hypothesizing, but I think that was because allotment gardening for a very long time in England was really an experiment. Now when we look back, we see, let's say, persistent forms, we see a consistency in how these schemes were deployed. We can even read through the ideologies behind them. But for that time, for people living in that moment, these schemes were very experimental. They were, I think, they weren't recognized as a paradigm, a spatial paradigm of parcellation of land and reorganization of urban land, for example. So it is only afterwards when Colin Ward and David de Crouch started, writing about anarchy and then understanding or reconsidering the allotment as a possible site for self-building, that this relationship or possible relationship started to be, let's say, fleshed out.
But they wrote in the 80s, right?
Yes, much later, exactly, much later. So, but I also think that it has something to do with the context where anarchic ideas are received. I think now I wouldn't take them so literally. I would maybe grasp an aspect of like, for instance, the possibility of common ownership, but that could be taken not as a scenario that coexists with the state. It doesn't presupposes the elimination of the state, because the problem with anarchy is that it wants to end something that is, it has a very kind of large apparatus of structure, and I think, And I think when you think about something that can coexist with this condition of the state organizing things, but you can think about small organizations, maybe small groups of people purchasing lands together and self-managing, self-building, something that doesn't rely on either on the elimination of the state or on let's say total let's say politics of managing everything. So if you really consider the possibility of common ownership as something that can coexist with the status quo, then I think everything starts to become more, let's say, more possible, more tangible, and also more interesting, because then the possibilities are endless. It's not so. I think the problem with anarchism at that time was to not understand that the course of action, maybe the most smart course of action, was not really about eliminating that state, but really finding a way, let's say, to coexist with it. So having these spaces of emancipation, of solidarity, that would somehow resist to the enclosure of the commons and so on.
Yeah, no, because I mean, small just feedback, because I think it's very interesting how let's say the reverse of the interest from architects in the countryside in the last 30, 40 years more or less coincide with the rise of the extreme right that we see in classic, voting diagrams, that the city is left, the countryside is right, and because we architects have been so busy with the city, we have no idea the politics of the countryside, so we cannot speak to them. And then when I hear your story and when one reads other historical documents, it's very interesting how, because in the countryside, or when you're dealing with plants, all of a sudden you realize the possibility of your self-determination, and it becomes the historical site for anarchist ideas to bloom. But I think it's very, very interesting response. I know that others can speak.
I have a question. Thank you, first of all, for the presentation. The question is mostly related to the passage that you mentioned, that in order, especially for the working class, there was this, let's say, moment of educational moment through rules in order to educate this to basically this new practice. Also, as you mentioned, it was a pedagogical project in parallel to that, which seems to me to be connected also to the fact that already in the 16th century, for example, in Oxford colleges, the integration of gardens becomes also a tool for implementing the pedagogical, let's say, program of universities, and make it in parallel to the architectural project also a pedagogical one. So the question would be eventually, in order to also consider, especially our contemporary situation, especially in the project that you propose, in the hypothesis of the students, if this project of solidarity could somehow needs the support of, let's say, pedagogical effort or pedagogical system in order to achieve this form of solidarity. Because, I mean, it's also a cultural situation, and it's not very easy, and especially in terms of gardening, it requires a lot of commitment and effort. So I wonder if in your projects and in your more practical work, you also have thought about this.
Yes, yes, I have, and I think it would take it would definitely be, let's say, a pedagogical project, hence the issue of gardening being quite central to it. And in that sense, I think it would also, let's say, require let's say space, required. So it would be a very kind of spatial, let's say, process or experiment, because self-organization and let's say the formation of these social relationships and skinships, based on these agreements and common interests. Because solidarity is basically this. It comes from this shared interest or shared goal or even a shared struggle that really binds people together. So groups of people could be bound by the need for maintenance, maintaining spaces, or sharing the workload, or the struggle even to free time, struggle for having free time. So I think in the sense of people organized, self-organizing, I think space and how space can be transformed, as a kind of a everyday process is really critical. And I think perhaps the garden is one of those spaces where this relationship between the rules and these agreements, making use of spatial organizations to basically be performed by this group of people is really crucial. And because although a garden takes time to be transformed through gardening, it is fairly easier to transform garden spaces than buildings, no? And also there is regulations, no? Regulations with gardens and open spaces are far more relaxed than they are with buildings, especially in London. So it's hence the take on gardening, because I think in a way this thesis could be also, let's say, could also take other architectures, but I think the garden could be a quite critical one because of that, because of let's say the potential for gardening to become this kind of everyday process of building and reorganizing space collectively.
Now, just to point out, maybe as a comment, how the importance of eventually institutions and like universities or even the municipality itself or the government somehow, in order to create the, let's say, the conditions in order to make this possible. Because there is still the problem how much spontaneous could be a form, let's say, of putting people together, or how much it could also be driven from, let's say, major decision-making, let's say, entities, municipalities, universities, in terms of more cultural, let's say, education.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, in England, I didn't stress this too much, but in England, still councils and local authorities, they have the duty to provide allotments if local residents request. So they call it a provision upon demand. So if there is a local demand or petitions for allotments, then councils have to arrange them in some ways. So I think that's continues to be fairly affirmative. It's actually a very positive thing. The problem is that in a city like London, these schemes they don't live very long because then the area is gentrified and then they are threatened with encroachment and eviction. And they are quite ambivalent because at the same time they are affirmative, they provide workers with welfare and means of production, but at the same time, because they are so successful, they make these neighborhoods thrive. And so they anticipate, if not, drive or enable gentrification to happen. And they eventually become the very first victims of it. So, but I think that happens with architecture. another I think I didn't include here, but there is a sentence saying that the very production of space is what valorizes it. No, so if we build, if we inhabit. From the point of view of capitalism and real estate markets, we are already bringing value to the space, to urban space. So it's like it seems that no matter what we do, it will basically become an asset for the capitalization, further capitalization of space later on.
Thank you very much for the presentation. And just a sequel on the question on pedagogy, because you showed the hypotheses by students that were mostly dealing with space, and in an attempt to create subjective space or kind of spaces for negotiation. And I was wondering if the site of architectural intervention could also be outside of space, for instance, legislation or even time too, because you said that there is also a lack of idle time and also, I guess, less demand because people have less time to for this subjective space to be constructed. So I was wondering if we're also exploring other roles as architects or other, as you said, maybe possibility of being more involved within the community, maybe taking a kind of grassroots approach, but also intervening maybe in terms of legislation, because you mentioned that the legislation hasn't changed for nearly a century. So I was wondering if these were also possibilities that the research raises, but also more pedagogical avenues.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. It definitely makes us question architecture practice, for sure, and also design is something that doesn't really stop. At the moment something is built. No, it continues. So it's definitely a very important question. Perhaps it's the next phase in the research. It's a question I always ask my students and myself, and there aren't so many case studies. So I think it's definitely something to be explored further. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But I think that, as Alfredo was saying, I really like that you were building the research backwards. No, it felt that you were digging on these allotment gardens and progressively like finding like layers of this history that take you back to the open fields and to the pre-enclosure London and surroundings. But I think there's always like in this kind of way of working backwards, one can like too quickly connect like these two moments, no? The first one and the last one, like the origin and like the genealogical way of writing history, no? And I think that what you're doing in the end is I find more interesting than this kind of genealogy, because in every stage you're showing us that the politics of gardening, of cultivation, are changing, no? And the values that we ascribe to that act of gardening are not one, but actually they're very much determined by the mode of production, the type of ownership of the land, the type of organization of labor, and so I think this connects also to what Alfredo and Marcel were saying about this question of the politics of gardening. No, so it's not warranted that gardening has anything that it's like, even if we would consider the solidarity aspects of gardening, that is inherently like emancipatory. No, like one could imagine like all of the stories of like gardening in Nazi Germany being like the like this connection of like land and soil. There's a very by Thiago Sarabia, which studies the ways in which within the like multiple like dictatorships, like the Italian, the Portuguese, the German, there were a constant focus on autarky and production of your like own crops were generating like new kind of, like objects. But so I wonder, when you look at the case of London today, and if there's a like a way of surveying what kind of politics are actually existing in these plots, and what do you see? Are there forms of organizing that are occurring? Are there things that respond to our specific mode of production, our moment?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, I agree. I think there are precedents that prove that many different contexts garden, especially when garden is inscribed within within private property and planning. It has been used as a means for colonizing, eternally colonizing land and rendering an image, legitimizing this colonization. I definitely agree with that. But I also think that in a similar, or let's say inverse way, it can also work to, emancipate people who are disenfranchised, and so I see in London today, especially around South London, the South Caribbean communities that I mentioned. Their allotment practice is slightly more, let's say, diverse or subversive than the very kind of, let's say, typical English allotment practice, which in many ways, I mean, it's quite, let's say, in the north of London, it's quite white, old white British male, still very much so, or at least it identifies with that kind of stereotype and culture, even when it's performed by women. There is a kind of this aesthetics of the allotments, and I think the uncritical appreciation of them has much to do with that. So even like this really strange understanding, of the workers' garden as being a very kind of male garden of the builder, the maker. It's a very subject, quite the East London subject. The guy with the fisherman beanie, and anyway, it's anecdotal but true. So I think I think there's a question of subjectivity here when it comes to how these places are, let's say, formed and inhabited. And I think it goes back to this question of how much is shared, how much these plot holders who are sharing that space have in common. And because in London, allotment gardens, let's say, they give priority to local residents. In a way, these people, they do share the same urban condition. So for a second generation British person from Caribbean heritage to live in the far south of London means something completely different than it does for, an old white male in Finchley. So I think the rituals, the way these sites are basically experienced and organized varies much because of these specific subjectivities of these local groups. I don't know if it answers the question.
Yeah, I was also wanting to know if there's specific cases of political organizing that you're or it's more like dynamics that you're identifying about like collaboration rather than isolation?
Yeah, no, nowadays, especially after COVID, because of the, let's say, the lack of free time, because of people really having to take more jobs and having basically no time to garden, to go to their garden plots, I see that there is less, let's say, collaboration. There is less, basically encounter and partnerships in these allotment gardens. But I think in general, it would be fair to say that at least London allotments, they are very quiet spaces, and most people like to garden alone. Yeah, that's why I also think it's quite hard to find very good precedents to argue these spaces as spaces of emancipations. I keep bringing it up in the presentation, but never really showing a full-fledged example where we see how emancipation, solidarity take place in practice in these spaces.
Although I have to say that, following this discussion that Javier shared about if there is a political use of this idea of allotments. I think there is at least in the situations I know, especially in Italy, where there's been a resurgence of urban gardening, there is a cultural war actually within the left about this, because the more extreme left or the more revolutionary left, what is left of that, is really against the idea of gardening. They really see it as a gentrifying thing, as a weak, bourgeois, middle class, blah blah blah. And then there is a feminist left that is actually really critical of that attitude. And I've seen actually a discussion where Leopoldina Fortunati and Silvia Federici were really defending these practices of care and gardening and say, this is really the problem of the extreme left, which you see already in Marx and Engels. It's like these two white youths, thinking that there is only a big revolution to be made, and everyone who is sick and is old we don't care. So I think that for me, I think this critique also of the gardening or the extreme left critique of the allotments has really big problems, because it still imagine these revolutionary movements being made of very fitting people who are only wants to they don't have this sense of pleasure, they don't have this sense of and also being alone, what's wrong with that? Being alone in an allotment is great. Why we have to only be all the time together discussing and arguing, I want to also be alone. That's my dream, I will live long enough to have that situation, So I think there is that war at the moment. It's war, it's a discussion. But I think that for me, that you refer to Silvia Federici, and she used actually the allotment in the cover of the book. I think for me this is a very interesting direction. And the question is how we can make these allotments not magnets for gentrification, but really as epicenters of, as you said, of solidarity, and even if they are places where we only seek rest and peace, what's wrong with that?
Also the places where we do nothing. It's interesting because architecture really never found let's say a good archetype for that. Maybe the garden could be one of those. How does one make space for doing nothing? Well, what is doing nothing nowadays? But on the feminist thing, there are a few questions now coming to the research, which is this, the fact that in England women have always been, let's say, well known for cultivating herbs, as herbs, also since monastic practice were the main ways through which, let's say, traditional medicine would be performed, and they have always played a big role in women's health, and of course that knowledge had been gradually dissolved and somehow destroyed, with projects of sanitation, and basically, in a nutshell, processes that have alienated women from the knowledge of their bodies. But I think this process of alienation has also a lot to do with alienation from the land. So once women and also any other laborer has been stripped from their common rights to lands, they have also been stripped from this knowledge of cultivating things for their own personal use and health and self-care. And so I think also this problem we can trace back to. I don't mean to say that every problem starts with enclosure, but we keep tracing, that many of the problematics we see today with the production of urban space is rooted in that moment of parliamentary enclosure and this elimination, this alienation of people from land cultivation. So the allotment, in a way, can be it can keep this possibility open.
Yes.
Last question. Could you pull up any examples of, I'm sorry, I can't debate, of allotments where, they have maybe the separation of the gardens, but the separations are not so strict that that they feel like you're looking at your neighbor from through the lenses. I don't know. Because of this question of they're allowing to be alone. I mean, it's nice, it is very good and important to be alone. And then if there's transparency, I don't know, it's kind of dialectic. So I don't know. Is there an example of that?
You mean of allotments or the other types of garden, like the private gardens, backyards?
Within allotments, within, or rather within a dense, maybe a dense area with the arrangement of gardens.
Yeah, well, this question with boundaries is very interesting, because basically nearly all allotment sites in London, the plots are never walled and almost never fenced. They are rarely fenced. So the boundaries are basically marked on the floor, and that demarcation is not even paved. It's just like, bare soil that isn't even grassed. Sometimes grassed, but or sometimes it has pebbles marking the pathways or the thresholds, let's say, between the plots, but never really walled. But this is interesting that you mentioned that people would garden in the presence of others and see each other, because it's interesting, a parallel, it goes back to that student drawing with the private property on the bottom of the screen, that when you see private gardens, backyard gardens of terrace houses, it's a very English thing. You see the walls in between these private gardens, they are just high enough to allow people to, if they, if they stretch a little bit, they can see each other and talk. But if they don't want to talk, if they want to be the unfriendly English character, they can just basically avoid contact because of this very kind of somehow low walls in between private gardens. In the allotments, you don't really have that, but you have the question of scale. So the plots are slightly larger than the private terrace gardens. And so you see the other plot holder gardening, but there is a kind of a spatial buffer between you, and you can still be gardening alone. And this is the idea that Lebrecht Miguel wanted with the gardens inside the allotment, inside the public park. He said that the portion, the scheme of allotments inside that park was a place where people could be alone together somehow, like the shared solitude kind of thing. So they would be gardening, side by side, but not, but not too much. Yeah, so it's, I think, the soft boundary is also about that, I think. Yeah.
Are there any, like, I don't know, people who try and convince the soft boundaries? Like, do you have any references of people who try and emulate soft boundaries in areas where there has been partitions?
You mean people who try to, for instance, ward their own plots?
No, the exact opposite. Like, people who try and encourage now, like, a counter way of having the boundaries.
You mean within allotment sites?
Yeah, yes, but yeah, kind of. Just the fact that gardens have boundaries or property having boundaries. Like, are there, like, what was the guy who said the idea of shared solitude is the.
I briefly mentioned this example, didn't expand much, but there is this project by an architect called Lebrecht Miguel for a park of gardens, of forests, really like this really beautiful civic public park that would also include a scheme of allotments in its plan. Yeah.
I think we should close. Thank you, Olivia.
Thank you so much.
And just a reminder.